Howdy, y'all. My name is Chris.
And I'm Linda.
We're the Padgetts. Welcome to the Chris and Linda Show. Obviously, we're desperate, and so we're getting dressed up for the occasion.
Yes, we have a fun episode. Well, maybe it's not super fun, but today we are going to outlaw the in-laws.
All right, I love that. For those of you who have cowboy hats, you can take them off now.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to keep mine on.
Yeah,
because
you look good on yours, but
my hat is
big.
covering a multitude of hair sins right now.
Yeah,
so.
I think your hat looks like it's been sat on too. So
does it?
Yeah, it's a little bent in the front, but that's okay. I won't judge you too harshly.
Okay, so here's the thing. Outlaw the in-laws. This is a weird topic, and obviously we're not inviting couples to disrespect family members, especially parents, in-laws, that kind of thing. But there is a really important principle at work here that we want to unpack.
Right. We do want to give a clear disclaimer on this point that we understand that we are coming at this from our background, the way we are as white Americans, that we have a very different perspective maybe than some people of other cultures and ethnicity. And our goal here in this is that you will take what you can from this talk, from this podcast, and apply it where you can. We believe it's an overarching principle, this idea that two people have become one, and that there is an importance about putting boundaries to the in-laws. But how that looks specifically for your relationship and your family, it may be different than what ours looks like. And so that's the disclaimer. So we have a couple points on how to get the in-laws out if that's a problem in your relationship.
Right. All right. So we're going to dive in. The very first thing that we want to talk about with regards to outlawing the in-laws is know the terrain.
Know the terrain. We got a theme going here, right?
We do. We are getting it.
So know the terrain. What is the terrain? That is your marriage. What is the point of your marriage? What is the significance of the scripture saying two people becoming one? Right? And understanding that is a good place to start so that you're not muddled with the idea that you have to be all this people pleaser and make all these people happy, because ultimately your marriage is about two people. Well, three, I guess, if you count God.
Yeah, and I do want to start there. If you look at the example, or really the model, right from the beginning of Scripture of what a marriage is to look like, you can look at Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. Of course, Eve is from the side of Adam. That rib is used in the creation of Eve. And that's really meant to be more than just kind of a neat little, oh, you're part of me and I'm part of you. It's like a John Legend song, I think. All of me loves all of you. Is that right? The point is that that rib next to the heart is really important. That this is a fellowship, a journey together. This is a helpmate, and not someone who's to be subservient or beneath the other. So that complementarity and that walking together in the cool of the day with God, that doesn't include in-laws. Interestingly enough, I mean, you have the couple and their world, and that terrain is a gift from the Father to them. This gift. And there's something about that I think is really important for us when we talk about the idea of the terrain. All that you have together is gift. We recognize that what God has brought together, let no one separate. We know that God has brought you two together, and the two are meant to be now one. And that terrain is beautiful. And that terrain is also the avenue and the opportunity in which you have as a couple to become the saints that you're called to be. I think it's really important to recognize that you two have a work to do and an opportunity to be together as a couple, and that is what God intended.
Right, and that terrain expands and grows with family. Once you have your own family, and those children enter into your world, as you're creating your world, it's so important to make sure that what you're forming as a family is what you want to form as a family, not something that other people are telling you that you need to be doing. And again, the points that we make here, we've seen this played out in so many other couples, and even in our own story, that it's an uncomfortable place to feel like you are fighting for your identity, for who you are as a couple, for who you are as a family, when there's such a strong force trying to counter that in some way or another. So, but understanding who you are, understanding the value of marriage, the value of your identity as a couple, is a good place to start. Now, after you have assessed the terrain, you're going
Know the train.
Yeah, yes, you know that. Assess, know the terrain. Okay,
Uh-huh.
yeah. You are going to assess the threat.
There we go.
There we go.
Yep.
So assess the threat. Who's out there? What does that mean? So what is, all right, this is, I think, so there's so many different ways to look at the threat. What in the world are we talking about? The threat is, obviously, I think most of you guys probably get it. If you've been married or engaged, that you understand the pressure that pulls. You get that from the very beginning with a wedding. As you're planning a wedding, you feel that tension and that pull of making everybody happy in order to plan this wedding. And you think, why do I care? Why do I care about what all these people think? That kind of tension can continue if you don't learn how to establish or outlaw the in-laws in your marriage. You continue with that. So you guys know what I'm talking about, but it can show up in just the tension between political views in marriages with different family members. It can holidays, the way holidays are run, the traditions that go along with holidays. Some people wanting to be more, forceful on their expectations of what you should be doing. You get this also in, oh my gosh, telling you how many kids that you should have or how to stop having kids. We remember the time when we received an envelope full of condoms from a family member because they thought we were having too many kids. That didn't settle too well with us. And then also how to spend your money. We remember the time when somebody called us and felt very frustrated that we were even considering buying a house when we were first married. But these are areas. These are the threats where you have people coming in wanting to give you their opinion, usually rather forcefully. Those are the threats. Those are the things that you have to look out for. Where do we have that in our relationship right now?
I want to talk a little bit again about that garden experience. I think it's really important for us to keep going back there, especially as couples. When you look at that place, the Garden of Eden, and all that was there provided by the Father God, the truth is that there was an abundance, a plethora of goodness from the Father to this couple. And there was a responsibility and opportunity. They were meant to tend and to keep. That was the role that Adam had. And unfortunately, he did not do that role. I don't know what they were doing, but they definitely were not tending and keeping, because the reason that the serpent shows up in the garden isn't some sort of haphazard type of thing, nor is it some sort of accident. The reason that Adam was put into that role and that responsibility of tending and keeping the garden and really even sharing with his wife the parameters and the boundaries that God had put in place, all of that was for their safety and for their betterment. And with the shirking of that responsibility of tending and keeping, the enemy shows up. Now, we're not saying or implying necessarily that every in-law is an enemy. That's certainly not what we're saying. But the truth is that anything that threatens the union and the intimacy that you have as a couple is a threat. And there are various levels of threats. There are some that are really emergency status level, and there are some that are let's just keep an eye out and be careful kind of level. And I think we're just asking you to be careful, because if you're not careful in this, if you don't assess the threat, then sometimes people find themselves overwhelmed a few years into their marriage because there are things that they can't stop. And in fact, that's usually the great difficulty. How do I basically rewind the time and fix what now has obviously become a big problem? The other part of this is that if you look at that garden experience, the union with within themselves. There was a peace there. And the union with them as a couple, there was a complementarity. And then the union that they had with God, there was no tension. There was no sin at work at that point in the pre-fall experience. What we're going to have in a marriage is a little bit of a struggle with this, because there are times that we don't feel completely at peace in one with ourselves, and sometimes we have a little bit of tension in our relationship. Like, for example, she or he might want to have the in-laws far more involved than maybe you do, and that tension can be at work. And then obviously, if you're not finding yourself walking with God, if you will, in the cool of the day, that union with God, things are going to be more difficult. This assessing of the threat, it does require that you kind of know what you've been given and know what it is that you're called to do. And I think that's where a lot of couples struggle, is that they love the idea of marriage. They love the idea of journeying with the person that sees them, knows them, but they're not really 100% sure as to what it is their role and responsibility is, and what they're protecting from.
Right. That's a good point for sure. No, it goes back to know the terrain, that know what you're protecting. That's a good point. I also like your point that that there's different levels of threats, right? And that we don't want to perceive in-laws, even the most difficult and toxic of in-laws, you don't want to perceive them as enemies.
Right.
Because they're coming at you, they're coming at the situation from maybe their own place of woundedness and difficulty. And so they're in your life for a reason, and you want to allow God to use them for your own sanctity and perfection, right? But not at the destruction of your union in marriage and the health and the well-being of your family, your children. So assess the threat. The next one is to make a game plan, and this kind of goes along with what you were just saying. The idea, if you are not unified in that, so I think it's important, especially if there's a difference in culture and heritage between the spouses.
Right.
That's especially difficult, where you need to really look and say, well, in my heritage, we have a closer connection with extended family members. They're more involved in your life, and the other one isn't. That's where you have to be unified in that. Be willing to compromise. Be willing to find a middle ground on what your level of expectation is, because you can't really move forward in setting boundaries and all the other steps without being unified, right? Yeah.
Right. So this idea of making a game plan is really a big deal. Ultimately, what brings you peace as a couple when you think about how you want to do this thing called marriage, and what level of involvement you want family members, in-laws, inclusive of course, brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws and that kind of thing. If you don't have a clear understanding of what it is that you're going to allow, you can't really have a game plan that's going to work. So you have to have some specificity. I'm going to give you some real examples here. So my in-laws neither of them are still alive, but the earlier years that we had together were very difficult, especially with the father-in-law. That was a really tough time, I think, in a lot of ways, trying to figure out how do we navigate around someone who's obviously unhappy with himself, unhappy in a marriage, and then unhappy with the entirety of who I was and what I was doing, and the role I had in his daughter's life. But the truth is that he was a part of my life, period. There was no getting rid of him. And so what that meant was we had to really have a game plan. And one of the things that we did was that we knew that we weren't going to rely and depend on them for help that we might need with watching the kids, unless it was an absolute necessity. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but we picked and chose. We made very specific kind of boundaries for ourselves to know this is what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate. That game plan helped us to be at peace, so that I wasn't I mean, so Linda didn't feel like I was being overly vindictive and angry towards her father or mother because I was approaching things the way I was. Like we were in union and unity about that.
Right.
That helped it.
Well, finding that unity can be challenging. Because that even though I could recognize that my dad was a very difficult person to be around, there was a lot of qualities that were toxic to not only our individual health but to our children.
Yeah.
Right, that we didn't want to expose them to that. It's still, he's my father. And so
Right.
coming to that unified plan could be difficult. A lot of hurt feelings, lots of talking, a lot of pressing it out. But that kind of struggle to find that unity is so important because you just can't move forward without unity. So whatever work you got to do to find that one agreement, then do it. So that leads though to the next point, that after you've done all these things, you've made that game plan. It's boundaries, 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 boundaries. You got to establish boundaries, and I think this is a very trendy word right now. Big trendy word. You go to Barnes and Noble, it's shelves of boundaries this. And every relationship we have, there needs to be established boundaries. And I think in this day and age with social media, that's where we see a lot of boundaries being crossed. People crossing their own boundaries. We see the inappropriateness of oversharing. Oh my gosh. I remember the one time way back in the day when Blockbuster was still in business. I went to rent. I mean, I don't know, maybe I've already shared this on this podcast, but I went to rent a video and I got this woman's entire birth control history given to me as I'm trying to rent this video. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want to rent this video. I don't need to hear all about the adverse effects of the pill in your body. Like, this is insane. But that's kind of oversharing. People on social media, it's rampant. They're crossing these lines that used to be pretty clear of what we do and interact with different people. And so, and that's, I think, where even these crossing the boundaries, in-laws can cross the boundaries in our marriage by wanting to think that they have a say on our sex life, right? Or on our reproductive health or reproductive life. That's a boundary that you just don't cross. This is our reproduction, is our story. This is our choice here. Why do you think you have a say in that? So that's why it's so important to set these boundaries and keep them. So, but let's first start with establishing the boundaries.
So here's the thing with boundaries. This has been a hot topic, of course, recently, but also was something that was really important and recognized quite a while ago. Boundaries are something that it's not a new idea. There was a book called Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend, which I actually found to be pretty helpful because I think for me, especially... Huh?
When was that?
That had to have been written in the
90s?
Late 80s, 90s
really?
in that arena.
Okay.
The thing about that book is that I found it to be a little bit refreshing and helpful because I did struggle a lot with boundaries. Like, you could easily say I'm a mama's boy in a lot of ways because I wanted to please my mother, and I wanted, for that matter, even to please my father. And even in the relationship that I had with Linda's parents, I wanted to please them, to show them that I was going to be a good husband and a good father. But I think what I realized is that I'm being crushed here. And part of the reason I'm being crushed is that I'm not being clear about my boundaries. And so some of that was learning how to communicate. This is where I will give and this is where I won't give. I mean, I apologized numerous times to all of my parents and to my in-laws just because I wasn't sure I was doing that right. But I definitely did not give up on this idea of trying to clarify this I'm going to allow and this I'm not. And the peace and consolation I found was that Linda and I were united together in how we were going to do this. And so Linda's a lot stronger, I think, in some areas than I am. So she gave me great support when I needed it in terms of implementing boundaries. That's really about communicating and being consistent.
Right. Being consistent is important. Also, other tips on how to communicate these boundaries, be clear and charitable as best as you can, but you need to have a conversation as long as the other party is willing to hear that. That's why I say I think that I can look at my in-laws, your parents, and where we've asked, where we've set boundaries and said, here's a boundary, to me, the greatest thing is that they have honored that and respected that. And that some people, that is not maybe in everyone's family
Right.
where they will respect those boundaries, but you still need to communicate them and sometimes communicate them multiple times. It's important maybe to use the I statement or the we statement. We feel uncomfortable when da 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 da, right? Not so much, hey, you're crazy and you're toxic and I don't want you in my life, but it's that we are choosing to do something different than maybe what you, and it's not to judge and condemn what you've done, but we're doing something different. Setting us apart, not necessarily as yourself better than the others, because they're going to get real defensive on that, but using those kind of I, we statements, not so accusatory, trying to understand what the other person, what the other couple or the in-laws are feeling, right, is important. And like I said, be consistent. Now, I think that on this point, Chris, you wanted to talk about that this establishing boundaries doesn't mean that you're breaking the third commandment. Is it the fourth commandment? The third commandment.
Right, obey your mother and father.
Which commandment is that?
The thing about this is that that's all right. We'll put it up on the.
They know, yeah.
The thing is that with regards to that, boundaries are not. You're not being disrespectful and breaking a commandment. Your role in terms of obedience to your parents, it's really important for you as a young person. But when you leave and cleave and you're creating this whole new world, little Disney.
You just can't help
I might
yourself.
have a copyright issue if I start singing that. The point is that you're creating your own infrastructure. So now you honor and you respect your parents, but the idea of obedience is not really the same. You're a whole different family dynamic and union. So if you look at even, for example, the way that the Proverbs 31, where it talks about the virtuous woman, at the end talks about the children, praising the mother, and this idea of, the arrows and the quiver that's filled, that imagery that's given in the Old Testament for a parent. The idea of sons, aiding and assisting their father, those are great, important images for us to hold to. But the idea of obedience is a little bit different when you have your own family dynamic and you reach the age of reason and are now an adult. I bring all this up because I think some people really struggle with this idea of I have to do what my mom and dad say. But once you are your own family unit, and really for that matter, once you're an adult, things do change. And actually, in my own personal life as a parent, once my kids reach a certain age, specifically 18, or are no longer in my house, the way that I can reach into the life and control a scenario and situation is radically different. Right. I'm no longer able to use the I'm your dad, do what I say card because they're an adult now kind of making their own way. Now, what really I think is important with this is to communicate with each other. And you might want your parents involved in a lot of your decision making, especially early on, because you realize you don't know what you're doing.
They have wisdom.
They have that wisdom. They have that insight. So respect your parents. Like, that was great advice. Or you can say, I tried what you said. It didn't really work for us, but thank you so much for taking time out of your day. We're going to do it a little bit differently. And boy, if it doesn't work, I'll be coming back to you for more info. Because a parent usually wants to be involved in their kid's life, but they do, I think, even internally recognize I'm not supposed to, like, there's this idea of letting go as a parent that is super hard. And that's a whole different conversation. But there's something inside of them that wants also to let go. And by you taking responsibility and establishing those clear boundaries and letting them know that you still want them in your life, that you're respecting them, all of that allows mom and dad to step back a bit and allows us to step back a bit and think, okay, they're going to be okay. And that's really at the heart of it. That's all I want as a father and as a father-in-law. I want my kids to be taken care of. I want them to be happy. I want them to be pursuing the faith. And I can move back a little bit and watch and wonder as they do that, as they kind of come into their own. But they won't be able to come into their own if I'm constantly micromanaging everything.
Right. I think also, though, on this point too, establishing those boundaries, that may be difficult for certain individuals because of just the growing up in a dysfunctional home with a dysfunctional relationship with those parents, then I get so. Like always, we would say maybe you need to find someone to help walk you through this idea of that you are not responsible for your parents' happiness ever, even as a child, but and especially as an adult in your own marriage, you're not responsible to make them happy and to fulfill all their desires and dreams, that you are your own person. And so establishing those boundaries key. But the next step is to maintain those boundaries yourself. Keep the boundaries yourself, not to allow certain things to come along and say, oh, well, we said we didn't, like, we're going to stay independently, financially independent from our in-laws. And we're not going to take their money. But then all of a sudden, but you really want this one thing, or you're really having at a difficult moment where you're like, maybe we will take that money. Again, no judgment. That's something that you have to be on the same page with, and understand how that works within the boundaries that you've set. But stay consistent with those boundaries yourself. Don't get wimpy, I guess. But
Yeah.
On this also, another important point that I like to make on this aspect is one way in which we cross those boundaries is when we talk about our spouse to somebody else, especially in-laws. And again, this could apply to not just in-laws. It could apply to nosy neighbors. It can apply to friends, siblings, grown children, anybody that wants to step into your space as a couple, that this is your space, your holy ground. Anybody who wants to step into that can be, you're going to use these steps for them as well. So keeping your own boundaries, it means keep your mouth shut about what you say about your spouse to somebody else. If you're going to go talk trash about your spouse, or you think you're venting or joking, that is a crossing of the boundary. You, in a sense, you are inviting them. You're opening the gate of the boundary and inviting them into your relationship by being like that, by saying those things, by being critical or whatever. Now, obviously, again, if you need help or need advice, then judge that carefully and be careful who you ask for advice. Because in the end, we find that there are certain in-laws or other people in your life that once you get them in there, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to hunker down and they're going to pop their tent and they're going to stay there forever. So be very careful. Don't let yourself cross those boundaries at difficult moments.
I think this idea of boundaries is especially difficult if you have a family dynamic that, I don't know, is really blending. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have your mother-in-law living with you, then that's going to be really difficult to have certain boundaries because, they're always there. And maybe you need them always there because they're helping to babysit the kids so you can go and do work and all of that. That's great. I think what you want to do is you want to be clear about your boundaries right from the beginning and try to hold on to as much of that as you can. Because again, once you kind of give in and you allow them to have room in certain decision-making scenarios, then you're relinquishing some control. And maybe if you guys are both in agreement with that, then that's fine. Like when we had to allow for maybe our kids to be watched by Linda's parents, it wasn't like this was some sort of danger scenario. It wasn't that. It's just we knew that there was going to be potentially certain things that would happen, things that they might hear that could maybe be a little bit negative in their formation and upbringing. So we wanted to kind of protect that from happening. And we were in union about that. But we also wanted them to experience their grandparents and to have memories with their grandparents. And so there was this kind of balance. Now, we for a while had my mother-in-law living with us, and we had a little basement that was kind of constructed in such a way that it had a separate entrance and it had a restroom scenario, and she had her own room down there. So we've experienced that before. And there is something enjoyable and pleasant about seeing grandma come up, and she's a part of the family, and it was wonderful. But you just have to be at peace. And I think that's your big secret as a couple. Are you at peace when you establish these boundaries? And if you find that you're not at peace, which, by the way, I've experienced that a lot over the years, where I felt like this might be great, but then I started not having peace. At some point, I realized I can't live with this kind of disquiet in my spirit. I need to say something. And those were some tough conversations, but it was necessary because we're establishing our boundaries. This is our perimeter, and and we have to be at peace in order to, tend and keep and do what we're called to do. The last point
is stick to your guns. I think the important point, the aspect of this point anyway, is the idea that this can be very painful. That some of you, we can joke about how kick those in-laws out and all that kind of stuff, but there are some of you who are struggling with some real toxic situations in your family life that is hurtful. That especially if you have somebody it's a parent that maybe is struggling with some serious mental health issues, whether that's addiction, narcissism, codependency. I mean, there's so many things that those your parents or in-laws could be struggling with that really seep toxicity into your marriage and family life. And to put that boundary up and to stick with it, despite the fact that you, again, want that relationship with that parent, you want your kids to have a relationship with that parent, that is so hard. So we want to honor that, I think, in you, that this is not just a haphazard discussion here that, it's easy peasy, go do it. No, it's hard. And you're going to have to stick with something for extended periods of time. We've seen this in our own family with family members who've had to stick with their guns for a long time because they know they've done lots of self-evaluation, lots of discussion. They know that they're not in the wrong. They have sought, reconciliation with that family member. They have tried not to be hurtful to that family member, and yet they're still very hurtful towards them. So they have to put that boundary up and can hold it there for a long time. And so I don't know. I just think that in the end, we want to say, it's going to be hard. It may be very difficult, maybe very painful, maybe very isolating. But again, this is why it goes back to the first point here. Know the terrain, know what you're protecting, understand who you are as a couple and what you're protecting, and be united in that. Because that's what's going to get you through the difficulty here. And honestly, maybe sometimes you'll never find reconciliation with that member of the family. And that's sad. But you don't own that. If you're not at fault, you don't own that. And you can let that go. Let the Lord have that. Trust the Lord with the what's happening with that person and just kind of move on.
So this idea of consistency is obviously very important. And for those of you who have been implementing certain boundaries in your life and you've seen the fruit of that, we'd love to hear about it. So you can put some comments in the section below and let us know basically what's worked for you or what's some things that you've been struggling with that maybe you're interested in some insights on. We would love to be a part of that journey with you and help in any way that we can. Other thing to realize is that we're certainly recognizing that we might find ourselves tweaking and modifying some of these points and principles even as we continue to grow in our role as in-laws. And for our sons-in-laws, which is what we have in our life right now, there have been a number of different ways that we've interacted with them. And sometimes we're still learning as we go. So it's possible in the future we'll have some other podcasts, maybe something like, be super nice to your outlaw in-laws, The point is that we're passionate about marriage, and we recognize that there's so many different things that we can talk about. Maybe there's a topic that's on your mind that you want us to address. Feel free to send us an email, chrisandlindapadgett@gmail.com. You can send us questions or thoughts, and we'll be glad to hear from it. We'll be glad to hear what you have to say.
All right.
Finally, like, subscribe, spread the word, please. And those of you who are interested, we'd love to have you involved. We are so grateful, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.